Today I'm going to talk about the Pacific Coast Militia Rangers. They were formed in 1942 to delay the Japanese if they invaded the West Coast. There was 10,000 of them. They were volunteers and they used their own firearms. If they didn't have a firearm, they were issued 30-30s or surplus military rifles. And this is one of the first 30-30s that was issued. It was issued to the commanding officer of the Westminster region. And you can tell it's a military firearm by markings on the receiver of what's called a C broad arrow. It's also marked on the buttstock and on the forend. A quick way to tell is this special fitting that was put on the barrel to take the Lee Enfield sling. The reason they issued 30-30s instead of .303 caliber rifles, the .303 caliber rifles were being issued to the troops going overseas, and they didn't want to take 10,000 away from the fighting men to issue in BC. So they felt that 30-30 was all right for use in the mountains, and they could buy them from the United States without affecting our Canadian military production. This is an example of a Sten gun. Again, this was issued mainly to sergeants and officers. I don't know what the issue was, but they were common throughout the Pacific Coast Militia Rangers. The Pacific Coast Militia Rangers never saw battle, but they trained on the use of explosives to blow up bridges, to blow trees across roads. They also trained on heavier weapons in case the Japanese invaded, but they were being trained to delay the Japanese, not fight them. And they would delay them until the regular army came from the east to fight the Japanese. Then they would become guides for the regular army, because the regular army would be lost in the mountains, just like the Japanese would be. The recruiting for the Pacific Coast Militia Rangers was basically from children as young as 15, and there were two that were in their 90s. The ones in the 90s were instructors. The young men that joined were normally used as runners to carry messages from one place to the other. And the youngsters were issued with 30-30s as well. Some of the senior people were issued with Sten guns, and again to get firepower in close range work. Initially they didn't have a uniform, so initially they just had an armband to tell where they were from. This is an example of the armband. So it's number 2 company, Pacific Coast Militia Rangers, and that's where it's from. The Pacific Coast Militia Rangers were recruited throughout BC's. Most little towns, especially if they were a timber town, had a unit. Here is one unit for the 29th Sardis Company, and they're on the way to get training. What's interesting about the recruits is that in a timber town, the owner of the mill might be a private, where the person who worked in the forest might be the captain of the unit. So it's quite a reversal in roles, depending on your abilities in the forest. After 3 years of service, the Pacific Coast Militia Rangers stood down on September 30th, 1945. During their period of service, they received no pay. They were strictly volunteers to protect Canada.